Before 1914, the great powers of Europe believed they could regulate warfare. They met in the grand halls of The Hague and Geneva to sign treaties banning poison gas, protecting civilians, and safeguarding neutral countries. These laws did not aim to prevent war, but to contain it, to keep conflict within civilized bounds. Yet when the industrial meat grind of the Great War began, those legal restraints proved fragile. In the face of total war, long-standing norms were selectively ignored, reinterpreted, or discarded altogether. As one German chancellor famously dismissed international law, it became little more than a scrap of paper. In this video we will examine 5 major laws of war that were systematically violated or rendered obsolete by the belligerent nations of World War I. The principle of neutral inviolability was a cornerstone of the 19th century international order. It was intended to shield non-belligerent states from becoming battlegrounds in great power wars. 2 major agreements underpinned this principle. First, the Treaty of London established Belgium as an independent and perpetually neutral state, a status explicitly guaranteed by Europe's great powers. Second, Hague Convention reaffirmed that the territory of neutral powers is inviolable. Despite these commitments, Germany chose to disregard them. To bypass France's heavily fortified frontier, the German Schlieffen Plan required a massive advance through neutral Luxembourg and Belgium. On August 4, 1914, German forces crossed the Belgian border. When challenged, German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg dismissed the treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality as a scrap of paper, justifying the invasion through the doctrine of Notstand, necessity, arguing that necessity knows no law. The violation of Belgian neutrality became the decisive factor in mobilizing British public opinion and provided the legal justification for Britain's declaration of war. However, neutrality was not respected consistently by any side. In 1915, the Entente powers landed an expeditionary force at Salonika in neutral Greece to aid Serbia. While Greece was deeply divided internally between the pro-Allied Prime Minister Venizelos and the neutralist King Constantine, the landing still violated Greece's formal neutral status under international law. The prohibition of chemical warfare was governed primarily by the 1899 Hague Declaration, which banned the use of projectiles, whose sole purpose was the diffusion of asphyxiating gases. Yet this narrow wording soon proved vulnerable to legal manipulation. The first breach came through what became known as the cylinder loophole. During the first large-scale gas attack at Ypres in 1915, Germany released chlorine gas from stationary industrial cylinders. German officials argued this did not violate the treaty because no projectiles were used. As gas warfare evolved, belligerents exploited a second loophole, the sole purpose clause. Shells that combined explosives and chemical agents were deemed legal on the grounds that gas was not their exclusive function. Once chemical warfare was introduced, restraint collapsed. Britain and France, initially condemning Germany's actions, soon launched their own gas attacks, officially framing them as lawful reprisals. This escalation led to the widespread use of increasingly lethal agents, such as phosgene and mustard gas. The catastrophic consequences of this legal failure eventually prompted the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which imposed a far broader ban on chemical weapons. Prize laws were a centuries-old legal framework governing naval warfare. They required warships to stop, search and, if necessary, capture merchant vessels while ensuring the safety of civilian crews. World War I rendered these rules increasingly impractical. Submarines, unlike surface warships, were too small to take prisoners and too vulnerable to surface safely. By 1914, many merchant vessels were armed, making compliance with prize law potentially suicidal for U-boat crews. In response, Germany abandoned prize law in practice and in February 1915 declared unrestricted submarine warfare. Berlin argued that Britain's sweeping naval blockade, especially its expansive definition of contraband, was itself of questionable legality. In retaliation, German submarines began torpedoing ships without warning. This policy directly led to incidents such as the sinking of the Lusitania. While some U-boats commanders initially attempted to observe prize rules, the nature of submarine warfare ultimately made traditional naval law impossible to enforce. Non-combatant immunity was a fundamental principle of the Hague Conventions. Yet World War I's total war mentality increasingly blurred the distinction between soldier and civilian. This erosion began during Germany's invasion of Belgium. German commanders, fearing irregular resistance, adopted a policy of Schrecklichkeit, frightfulness. Entire towns, including Louvain, were burned and civilians were executed as collective reprisals for alleged partisan attacks. In 1914 alone, more than 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed under doctrines that clearly violated international law. The disregard for civilian immunity expanded beyond occupied territories. German naval forces shelled British coastal towns, and Zeppelin air raids brought the war to London and Paris, ignoring the spirit, if not always the letter, of Hague Convention, which restricted bombardment of undefended cities. The gravest violations occurred on the Eastern Front. The Ottoman government orchestrated the Armenian Genocide, a systematic campaign of deportation and mass murder that the Entente powers explicitly labeled a crime against humanity in 1915. Meanwhile, the chaotic retreat of Russian forces from Galicia was accompanied by widespread abuses against Jewish communities and ethnic Germans, including deportations and pogroms, crimes driven by paranoia, nationalism, and military collapse rather than centralized extermination policy. The Hague Conventions required captors to provide adequate food, shelter, and humane treatment for prisoners of war, while limiting the types of labor they could be compelled to perform. In practice, these safeguards failed in four major ways. First, capacity collapsed. States such as Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Serbia were unprepared to manage millions of captives. In Serbia, nearly 20% of Austrian POWs died of typhus due to shortages of food, medicine, and shelter. Second, forced labor became routine. Although some non-military labor was technically permitted, prisoners were frequently compelled to dig trenches, clear minefields, and perform dangerous work close to the front. Third, starvation spread. The British blockade and the economic disintegration of the Central Powers meant that prisoners often starved alongside civilian populations. Finally, systemic discrimination emerged. Russia implemented a tiered POW system, treating Slavic prisoners relatively well, while sending German, Hungarian, and Jewish captives to brutal labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. The widespread failure of the Hague system did not end the law of war, but it forced its reinvention. These experiences directly shaped the 1929 Geneva Convention, an attempt to rebuild and strengthen the legal protections that World War I had so catastrophically undermined.